Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 6, Thomas Hobbes. Our topic is Laws of Nature and the Covenant. After presenting a horrible picture of the state of nature, Hobbes proceeds to discuss how man can escape it. In addition to being a slave of passion, man is also endowed with reason, a faculty which tells him about the measures that may, if followed sincerely by all, lead to peace and security. Unbridled pursuit of self-interest leads to war, but rational self-preservation would not only avoid the fatal risk of war, but would be more effective in securing every man what are the necessary means of preservation. At least it would enable man to avoid the risk of violent death. Hobbes has no philosophy of summum bonum. The final concern of man, according to him, is to the avoidance of summum bonum. The laws of nature are called the theorems of peace. Hobbes defines a law of nature as follows. A law of nature is a precept or general rule found out by reason, by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life, or taketh away the means of preserving the same, and to omit that by which he thinketh it may be best preserved. Further, law and rights differ as much as obligation and liberty, which in one and the same matter are inconsistent. Hobbes then lists as many as 19 laws of nature, three of them being of utmost importance. These are: first, that every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it, and when he cannot obtain it, then he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war, the first branch of which rule containeth the first and fundamental law of nature, which is to seek peace and follow it. The second, the sum of the right of nature, which is by all means we can to defend ourselves. The second one is that a man be willing, when others are so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself he shall think it necessary, to lay down this right to all things, and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. This is the law of the gospel. Whatever you require that others should do to you, that do ye to them. The third one is that man perform their covenant made. These are other laws of nature which are not generally emphasized, but they are quite important in so far as they show that Hobbes is really not the type of psychological egoist or ethical subjectivist that he is usually made out to be. These are justice, propriety, compliance, equity, against pride, against arrogance, etc. The laws of nature play a crucial role in the transformation of the state of nature into civil society, but they raise highly controversial and difficult questions which have been a subject of continuing debate. Here we can mention them only briefly. First, there is the question of the nexus between the state of nature and the laws of nature. Are these laws operative in the state of nature? If not, in what sense are they natural? If the description of the state of nature as the war of all against all is to be taken seriously, laws of nature obviously do not play any effective role in the conduct of man in that state. How can then purely egoistical and passion dominated individuals suddenly awake to the life of reason and decide to abide by the norms of peaceful and cooperative life by surrendering their natural rights to all things? If, on the other hand, reason is an essential element of human nature, how could individuals be absolute devoid of it in the state of nature? The paradox arises out of the fact that Hobbes analytically separates two parts of human psychology, passion and reason, and delineates their working alternately in order to show by a sleight of hand, as it were, that the only alternative to anarchy is absolute rule. Hobbes says that the laws of nature lies in faro interno, that is to say, they bind to a desire that shall take place, but in foro externo, there is to say, putting them in act, not always. Even if one intends to abide by the law of nature, fear and distrust of others impel him to take preemptive action as dominant strategy towards of possible danger. This situation is exemplified in what is nowadays called prisoner's dilemma. Hobbes' own contemporary, the Earl of Clarendon, posed the question very precisely, and no satisfactory answer has ever been given to it. How should it else come to pass that Mr. Hobbes, whilst he is demolishing the whole frame of nature for want of order to support it, and makes it unavoidably necessary for everyone to cut his neighbor's throat? I say, how comes it to pass that he would, in the same and the next chapter, set down a body of laws prescribed by nature itself, as are immutable and eternal, that there appears by his own shedding a full remedy against all that confusion, for avoiding whereof he hath devised all that unnatural and impossible contract and covenant. Then we have the problem of obligation. Are natural laws merely maxims of prudence or objectivity valid and immutable principles of morality? There is ample evidence in Hobbes' text to support divergent interpretations. Adam Smith's estimate of Hobbes' theory has been widely accepted for about 2 centuries. That odious doctrine, offensive to all sound moralists, as it supposed that there was no natural distinction between right and wrong, and that those were mutable and changeable and dependent on the mere arbitrary will of the civil magistrate. The exactly opposite view, known as the Taylor thesis, was propounded in the mid 20th century, according to which Hobbes' ethical theory is a strict deontology of the Kantian type. Another version of this view, expounded by Warrender and Hood, regards it as divine command theory in the classical natural law tradition. In this interpretation, Hobbes' psychological egoism is disengaged from his ethics, and the latter in, is represented or reconstructed as a consistent system of transcendently valid ethical norms, which are obligatory interdependently of their beneficial consequences. Natural law is true law of reason, binding upon both the subject and sovereign, but its binding force or obligatory character arises out of the will of God. Yet another interpretation makes of Hobbes a virtue atheist, laying emphasis not only rights but on good or virtue. In between the two extremes comes those readings which regard Hobbes' ethics as a kind of prudential reasoning, justifying natural law on conventional, contractual, or utilitarian grounds. According to Kafka, Hobbes is a rule egoist, adopting a kind of reconciliatory position between moralism and act utilitarianism. J. W. N. Watkins, refuting the charge that Hobbes committed the naturalistic fallacy of deriving moral perception from factual premises about human psychology, argues that his laws of nature are not moral perceptions, but they are more like doctor's order of a peculiarly compelling kind. They are assertic, hypothetic imperatives. According to Plasmnes, the laws of nature are dictates of reason, not as imperatives which follow logically from statement of facts, but as rules which only creates capable of reasoning could think or could want to see observed. In Plavnev's opinion, God is superfluous in Hobbes' theory of morality. As we have said, Hobbes' own words are not quite unequivocal. He says, these dictates of reason man used to call by the name of laws, but improperly, for they are but conclusions or theorems concerning what conducts to the conservation and defense of themselves, whereas law properly is the word of him that by right hath command over others, but yet If we consider the same theorems as delivered in the word of God, that by right commands all things, then are they properly called laws? Since, according to Hobbes, nothing is definitely known about God except his existence, it is argued by the critics that the introduction of God in this exposition is logically redundant and is meant only to assuage the feeling of those who were enraged by Hobbes' atheism. An obligation to obey God, says Planes, as Hobbes conceives of it, does not differ in kind from what the obligation to obey a human sovereign would be in a world without God. David Gunther observes that what is important to Hobbes' moral and political theory is natural law, quo dictates of reason, not quo command of God. Howard Warrender takes a firm stand against treating natural law as rational principles of self-preservation, devoid of moral implications beyond self-interest. Against Platonist, he contends the laws of nature are a special kind of rules for self-preservation and are not strictly rules for personal preservation. The individual may save himself by the most dubious means. They are rules for the preservation of man in general, and so the formula required for the state is not preserve yourself, but act so that all men can be preserved, except where this is inconsistent with your own preservation. This is, of course, an entirely different matter, and a preservation principle of this kind could never be derived from the ordinary self interest of the individual alone. If Planes dispenses with the role of God and leaves no substitute, such as a self evident natural law, how is such a principle be supported? Warrender here stakes his claim not so much on God as the basis of moral obligation as on the self evident character of natural law based on reason. Another controversial point of Leviathan that admits of different interpretations related to in foro interno and in foro external obligation. The laws of nature oblige in foro interno, that is to say, they bind to a desire they should take place, but in foro externo there is to putting them in act not always, but he that should be modest and traceable and perform all his premises in such times and place where no man else should do so, should but make himself a prey to others and procure his own certain ruin, contrary to the ground of all laws of nature, which tend to nature's preservation. And again, he that having sufficient security that others shall observe the same laws toward him, observes them not himself, seeketh not peace but war, and consequently the destruction of his nature by violence. And whatsoever laws bind in foro interno may be broken not only by a fact contrary to the law, but also by a fact according to it, in case a man think it contrary. For though his actions in this case he be according to the law, yet his purpose was against the law, which where the obligation is in foro interno is breach. The laws of nature according to the above explanation are clearly hypothetic imperative. They oblige only if certain conditions are fulfilled, but Hobbes also accords them the status of categorical imperatives. He says the laws of nature are immutable and eternal. For injustice, ingratitude, arrogance, pride, inequality, exception of persons, and the rest can never be made lawful. For it can never be that war shall preserve life and peace destroy it. Warrender interprets the above exposition to mean that the laws of nature oblige in foro interno, that is, in conscience, even in the state of nature. But since the validating conditions of their obligations do not obtain in that condition, they do not oblige in actual fact, that is, in foro externo. Warrender's view is that a single and consistent theory of obligation runs through the whole of Hobbes' doctrine, and obligation in the state of nature does not differ from obligation, a civil society in principle, but only in circumstances. Plumage and the Oakeshoots think that this is to go beyond what the text suggests. Michael Oakeshoot finds four kinds of obligation in Hobbes. There is a moral obligation to obey the authorized will of the sovereign. There is the external physical obligation arising from the force or power, and there is the internal rational obligation of self interest arising from fear of punishment and desire of peace. Each of these obligations provide a separate motive for observing the order of the commonwealth, and each is necessary for the preservation of that order. Political obligation is a mixed obligation consisting of physical, rational, and moral obligation combined to serve one end, but never assimilated to one another. There is another problem connected with the hypothetical nature of the laws of nature, which has been discussed by recent critics. This is Prisoner's dilemma matrix of the game theory, to which we have already made a reference. Under conditions of uncertainty and in the absence of the sovereign power to control the behavior of men, the dominant motive and strategy of a rational agent who wants to maximize his payoff would be to take a primitive action and attack whatever the other party might do. For if the other party attacks, one who attacks first would be decidedly in a superior position, and if it does not attack, the first invader would easily be able to steal a march over his rival. But if this analysis is correct, there is no possibility of men coming to an agreement to relinquish their natural rights unless there is a common superior to keep them in away. But the paradox is that this common superior cannot be created except by a covenant. The situation for Hobbes is, however, not so dismal as this analysis suggests. His individuals are not utility maximizers, but disaster avoiders. On sober thought, they would trust each other and take initiative in coming to an agreement. Hobbes' famous reply to the fool is meant to convince that it is always rational to abide by the laws of nature if the other party has already performed, and that justice, that is to say, keeping covenant, is a rule of reason by which we are forbidden to do anything destructive to our life, and consequently a law of nature. Here we want to wind up this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.